Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving into a history that is, it's vast, it's foundational, and yet somehow it feels largely invisible.
It really does.
We're exploring the centuries-long, deeply complex, and often forced relationship between Native Americans and Africans, and not just in the Americas, but across Europe and Africa too.
It's a huge undertaking, because historically, the whole narrative of the Americas has been trapped in this binary.
Right, this black-white or European native framework.
Exactly. We focus almost exclusively on European Native relations and European African relations.
And that focus has just tragically obscured what one scholar calls the invisible experience with an indivisible reality of African Native American lives.
The connection was always there. The spotlight was just pointed somewhere else.
And the sources you shared showed just how early and how intense this interaction was. This isn't something that started after the Middle Passage really took hold.
No, not at all. We're talking hundreds of years before and alongside. This is not a historical footnote. It's a central, foundational story of global history that we've missed because we were using the wrong lens.
So our mission today is to completely reset that lens.
We have to. We have to start by abandoning the old, simple assumptions, particularly around the meaning of, basic color and race terms.
Because the language itself was a tool.
The language was the tool.
Yeah.
That nomenclature was explicitly developed under the pressure of colonialism and racism to divide people.
Okay, so we're going to challenge that 1492 paradigm as the start point.
Yes.
Then we'll look at Columbus's direct role in accelerating the slave trade, including that shocking detail of shipping American slaves to Africa.
Which almost no one talks about.
And then we'll dissect how institutions like the U.S. Census distorted terms like black and mulatto to enforce this rigid caste system.
Precisely. Let's start by disrupting the timeline itself.
I love that phrase, disrupting the timeline, because like you said, the idea that 1492 is the start of all contacts is just demonstrably false.
It is.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Our sources present surprising evidence suggesting Americans were reaching the British Isles, even the coast of Europe, potentially as early as 50 BC.
That's based on analysis of favorable ocean currents and the navigational capabilities we know Americans already possess.
So it's not just speculation.
It's not. And beyond that, the sources establish a high probability that Americans kidnapped by the Norse reached northern Europe in the 1000s and again in the early 1400s.
So the flow of people was already going both ways, even if forced.
Demonstrably, not just westward.
And what about the other direction? African contact with the Americas before 1492?
Well, this is where you have these intriguing colonial reports that you just can't ignore.
Right, like by 1513, Spanish accounts were already mentioning black traders in the Caribbean.
And even describing a black village near Quaraquia in Panama.
Which implies a pre-Columbian, or at least a very, very early post-Columbian African presence that needs more tracing, long before the main slave trade really geared up.
And what's fascinating here is the need for scholarly rigor on all sides of this.
What do you mean?
Well, while these reports are suggestive, scholars who advocate for, say, extensive ancient African influence like with the Olmec giant heads, they has a critical task. They have to move beyond just noting a visual phenotype and place those images within a complete cultural historical process.
You mean to show the origin?
Exactly.
Yeah.
They need to demonstrate where similar carving existed in Africa between 800 and 300 BC to establish a definitive link.
So we have this evidence of scattered, maybe ancient contact that hints at a much more mobile world than we usually imagine.
But that initial contact, it just pales in comparison to the deliberate, massive, and destructive exchange that followed.
Which brings us directly to Columbus.
Yeah.
And your source material paints a very harsh picture of his intent.
He was, in a very singular way, a dedicated slaver and exploiter from the absolute moment he arrived. His purpose wasn't discovery. It was profit through human exploitation.
A dedicated slaver. I mean, on his very first voyage, he expressed a willingness to just depopulate Guanani for profit.
The source material is chilling.
It is. He kidnapped at least 27 Americans, and he specifically stated his intent was for them to be taken to Spain so they could learn the language and be, quote, fitted to be ruled and to be set to work.
It was an immediate financial model.
And that model became central to how he financed everything. He proposed that American slavery be used to finance the entire conquest of the region.
Planning to load ships with human cargo to be sold on the Canary Islands, the Azores, Cabo Verde.
Or wherever they sold well.
Wherever they sold well.
So he was actively proposing to sell American slaves into the pre-existing African trade networks.
Establishing a horrific two-way movement of human beings right at the start.
That connection, American slaves being shipped east to Africa, that is completely missing from most history books.
And it highlights a fundamental lack of humanity. Las Casas noted that Columbus didn't even call the enslaved people. He called them piezas, or
Yes.
quesas de cabras,
Yeah.
heads of goats. This commercial calculus set the stage for one of the greatest human catastrophes.
And that is the broader context we need to absorb.
Hmm.
The ensuing genocide it's just catastrophic.
I mean, look at the scale. The estimated world population in 1500 was roughly 400 million.
Okay.
A staggering 80 million of those people were in the Americas.
Wow, so a fifth of the world's population.
By the mid-16th century, just a few decades later, that American population is down to 10 million.
A near total collapse, if the word genocide applies anywhere.
It is here.
And the key takeaway, the thing historians often overlook, is that the tens of millions who disappeared didn't all die locally from disease or violence.
No. The source material confirms many thousands were shipped out, not just to Europe, but also to Africa.
Which leads us to the overlooked significance of the Native American presence on those continents from the 1490s onward.
Yes, their presence was significant enough to cause real, documented cultural diffusion that worked in reverse of the standard colonial model.
And this wasn't just indirect, like a new crop showing up in Lisbon. We're talking about direct diffusion of techniques like pipe making, cassava production.
And even profound intellectual ideas. Concepts of individual freedom, utopian socialism, that spread via direct American contact within European and African populations.
And this contact intensified dramatically in Africa.
Especially as regions like Angola and West Africa became so intimately entwined with Brazil through the Portuguese slave trade.
And there's that fascinating example of direct exchange, the Dutch.
Yes, the Dutch used Native American auxiliary troops, recruited from Brazil, directly in the conquest of Angola, Elmina in Ghana, and the Portuguese islands in the Gulf of Guinea.
When was this?
In the 1630s and 1640s.
So you had Native American soldiers fighting on the coast of West Africa.
Which means some Africans were exposed to American cultural influences, foods, languages, fighting styles, before they ever set foot in the Americas themselves.
The cultural exchange was happening on 3 continents at the same time.
It truly shatters that standard historical narrative of simple, one-way European influence. The global reality was multi-directional from the very start.
Okay, so let's pivot to what you called the extremely crucial task of correcting the distortions.
Right, the distortions that arise from the modern obsession with placing all identity within a rigid black-white relation.
This is where we have to dissect the language used in official documents.
And it is incredibly dangerous, the sources warn, to assume that every person referred to in historical documents as Negro or Black was necessarily African.
Especially in those early centuries.
Especially then. We have to remember that terms like Negro, Black, mooren, Pardo, colored, they were all fluid. And they were, at various times and places, applied to people of American ancestry as well.
So you can't just read current dictionary definitions back into the 16th century.
You'd be committing a serious historical error. You lose the true demographic reality.
And the term mulatto, that one has maybe the most specific and damaging distortion.
Because its modern meaning almost always suggests only a European-African mixture.
Which isn't accurate for the time.
Not at all. That is precisely the distortion we need to correct. In the 16th and 17th centuries, particularly in the Spanish colonies, the overwhelming majority of people they called mulattoes were actually of American African background.
Not European African.
No, that was the predominant blend.
And why is that distinction so crucial for you, the listener, to understand?
Because the term soon transitioned from a descriptive category to a purely legal mechanism of exclusion.
The shocking detail is in the English colonies, right? In Virginia?
Yes, in Virginia in 1705, Native American descendants were legally defined as mulattoes even when they had no African ancestry at all.
Which proves the point.
It proves that the term was a legal weapon used to strip rights and control property, completely independent of the actual biology involved.
That's a critical proof point. The term was just a mechanism of legal exclusion, and this tracks the evolution of racism, shifting from descriptive color terms to rigid caste names.
Initially, before around 1552, terms like moreno were generally descriptive. They just referred to appearance.
Like that quote from Francisco López de Gamarra.
Exactly. Writing in 1552, he described Native Americans as leonado or membrios cochos, stewed quince color.
So he saw a progression of colors, a natural blending across the globe.
But the colonial powers couldn't tolerate that. They soon introduced this rigid, narrowed concept of mestizaje, or hybridity,
which was a shift towards biological factors.
designed specifically to exclude people categorized as negroes or mulattoes from the ordinary rights and privileges enjoyed by white subjects,
These terms became the essential tools for social control.
allowing the state to quantify and thus limit access to power and wealth. And that control becomes most apparent when we look at the official mechanisms of the state, particularly the U.S. Census,
Right. The census is basically a tool the state uses to make society legible.
to impose categories that structure people's entire experiences.
And even at the very beginning, the 1787 Constitution was defining the population this way, counting slaves as 3/5 of a person, excluding Indians not taxed.
And the 1850 census became this key watershed moment with the formal inclusion of the mulatto category.
What drove that?
The political entrenchment of slavery and these emerging scientific theories used to justify racial hierarchy.
And the focus on racial quantification just got more and more intense.
It did. Enumerators were later instructed to record quadroons and octoroons, and by 1890 to calculate the exact proportion of African blood.
That focus on minute calculations is insane, and it highlights these contradictory, frankly bizarre rules of identity used to categorize the two groups,
At the same time,
all designed to maintain white supremacy. You had two opposing systems at work on people living right next to each other.
this is the core intellectual difficulty. For those with African ancestry, the rule was hypodescent.
The one-drop rule.
The infamous one-drop rule. It defined anyone with any known African ancestry as black, even if their appearance suggested otherwise. And this was especially enforced after the mulatto category was dropped in 1920.
But for Native American identity, the rule was the complete opposite.
The institutional goal was to narrow the population base, to make it smaller,
So they used hyperdescent.
which required a minimum amount of Indian blood, usually 1/4 or more, to officially claim that identity and access certain rights.
So just imagine the institutional chaos, the injustice.
The rules were designed for erasure. If you had one drop of African blood, you were black and excluded from white society.
But if you didn't have enough Native American blood, you were also excluded from tribal roles and federal benefits.
It ensured that vast numbers of mixed heritage people had no official place.
Then on top of all that, the census enumerators were frequently misclassifying Native people as mulatto, colored, or black anyway.
Right. Before the 1900 Special Indian Census started tracking mixed heritage, using what the sources call a wholly inaccurate calculation of Indian blood.
The official categories were never objective.
They were instruments of control and exclusion, period.
Which brings us to the actual demographic reality, which completely contradicts these official documents.
And the common misconception is that Native Americans in the Caribbean were simply replaced by Africans.
That view just fails to capture the complexity of the actual repeopling process, doesn't it?
It does. There was no simple replacement. What happened is that American survivors and African survivors merged together over centuries.
To create the basic modern populations of much of the greater Caribbean and the adjacent mainland regions,
That merger is the key to modern identity.
which means your appearance can be deeply misleading. It's common for people to look distinctly African but have significant Native American ancestry, or vice versa.
The interabsorption was immense. By the 19th century, Afro-Americans had absorbed considerable Native American ancestry, and Native groups had absorbed African ancestry over 300 or 400 years of intermixture.
So the ancestry of modern-day Americans, regardless of their dominant appearance, is usually incredibly complex.
We have to discard the shallow, one-dimensional images created by these colonial systems and replace them with multidimensional portraits that reflect this reality.
The sources reference the Smithsonian's IndiVisible project, which affirms this complexity. It uses the term African Native American.
Instead of Black Indian, because that latter term can sometimes obscure the complexities of tribal affiliation and African American identity.
So for those of you listening who are trying to research your own blended heritage, because, as we've seen, the historical focus on the black-white nexus hit a lot, the process requires some specific techniques.
The most critical starting point is always oral history. You must document and transcribe your elders' stories.
And be specific.
Very specific. Ask about tribal connection, language, the ancestor who was said to be Indian. That oral tradition provides the essential geographical and cultural direction for the paper search.
Then you move to the paper trail. Standard documents like marriage, birth, death, military records.
But also look for unique records, like tribal allotment certificates and land deeds that can tie families to specific territories.
And if you're researching formerly enslaved families,
You have to first identify the last known slaveholder and then research their estate records, their deeds, their wills. Those often name slaves by family unit and could include Native American lineage or spouses,
and finally, pay attention to the special roles.
like the crucial Dawes rolls for the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and others. They could be highly detailed.
One final modern caution.
Yes. While ancestry DNA tests are commercial phenomena that can offer hints, it is vital to remember that no tribes currently use those DNA fingerprint tests to confer citizenship.
Context is everything.
Genealogy requires documents and history, not just percentages.
So what does this all mean for us today? We've taken a deep dive through 5 centuries of deliberate obfuscation.
And we've seen that the focus on the black-white nexus completely hid a lot of this history.
We have to acknowledge that the ancestry of modern-day Americans, no matter their appearance, is usually incredibly complex.
And this history of forced, arbitrary racial classification ties directly into fundamental human rights and historical abuse.
How so?
It exposes the profound injustice inherent in, and I'm quoting here, the arbitrary and often racist practice of defining the identities of other human beings by powerful outsiders as well as by governments and institutions.
That is a powerful and necessary synthesis. The great myth of the United States, as the IndiVisible project highlights, is that the races were kept separate.
But the historical, cultural, and genetic realities that they never were.
Which leads us to our final provocative thought for you to carry forward. What forces in your own life, whether historical documents, contemporary media, or social expectations, have arbitrarily defined your identity? And how does acknowledging the reality of centuries of unavoidable intermixture empower you to define your own story rather than letting those institutional categories define it for you?
A critical question for self-reflection in a world still grappling with these rigid definitions.